President Trump's State of the Union speech was largely about domestic issues, but in foreign affairs, the Middle East still dominated. The first point he made when talking about the Middle East was the victories against ISIS and kicking them out of their main cities. Indeed, they have been roundly defeated in these big cities, but they remain a major threat. What President Trump did not talk about was whether the U.S. would be committed to staying in Syria or in Iraq and in helping in stabilization and reconstruction, challenges that are necessary to make sure ISIS or similar groups do not come back. The second point he moved on to was the issue of the decision to move the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, a repetition of a position he'd taken earlier. What was notable was that he said nothing about the peace process or any solution to the Israeli-Palestinian issue. In fact, right after mentioning Jerusalem, he moved straight on, in a sense, to a threat to say that no parties or countries would receive U.S. aid if they were not, quote-unquote, friends of the U.S. or following U.S. interests. That, I think, is a direct threat to the Palestinians, as well as to countries in the region like Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon, which voted against the Jerusalem decision. President Trump reiterated support for the protesters in Iran, although he still refuses to give any Iranians visas to the U.S., and he reiterated at least a rhetorical strong position on Iran. But I think what was most interesting, that on the key issue of the nuclear deal, he again kicked the ball to Congress, saying, "I call on Congress to fix what is wrong with the deal." He did not reiterate his position of a few weeks ago that this is the last time he, as the head of the executive branch, would waive sanctions against Iran. That seems to be kind of not a softening, but perhaps an indication that he might be willing to coexist with the nuclear deal. Also, interestingly, he did not mention anything about pushing back on Iran in Iraq or in Syria, particularly that his own Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, just a few days ago, announced a new policy in Syria, and that the U.S. would stay for the long term, partly to counter Iran's presence there. No mention of that. So still no clarity on this administration's actual Iran policy.